This is our video on the seventh petition of the Lord's Prayer, deliver us from evil. Now you will hear this petition in two ways. You will sometimes hear it generally, saying deliver us from evil in general, and then you'll hear it translated specifically or personally, saying deliver us from the evil one. Now the evil one is not just one particular person at the time, the evil one is the devil. Now you can read the prayer petition either way, deliver us from evil generally, or deliver us specifically from the evil one, who is the devil. I don't know how often you've had the opportunity to reflect on what you believe about the devil, but this would certainly be a time to do that. And maybe not even what you believe, but what you think, because the devil is not necessarily an object of our belief. But what do you think about the devil? I think in our age, you see that people are kind of split. Some people kind of keep to the idea that there's a personal creature, the devil, who's out to work against God's purposes, and some see evil more as a general principle. I would say there's enough data in the Bible that we have to take seriously that there is a creature, Satan, or the devil, who seeks to undo the good work of God. What we're going to do then is talk a little bit about the concept then of evil in general, and then we'll also talk a little bit about the devil. I know I've done that in other teaching videos for you, but we'll return to that figure as well. Now, when we talk about evil, we oftentimes think about it just as bad. So we talk about it in moral terms. Evil is really bad stuff. Evil is malevolent stuff. And I think that's all true, but I think we can get down a little bit deeper. When we get deeper into evil, what is it? Well, what we find is that evil is a kind of absence. And this is going to be a little bit hard to understand to begin, but stick with me and I think you'll get it just fine. It's a kind of absence, which is why it's associated so often with darkness. There's nothing there. Evil does not have its own existence. Evil is not something that God made. So let me say that phrase very clearly. God did not make evil. And in fact, if evil is what is opposed to God and God's will, it wouldn't make any sense for God to make it, because it would be a kind of unnecessary introduction into God's creation. And in fact, if you know the story of creation, this makes perfect sense, because when God creates everything He makes as good. God sees the creation and calls it good. God finishes a day and calls it good. Everything that God makes is good. So the reality of life at its root has this good call from God that brought it into existence. But we know that from there we had a kind of break. Something went wrong. And the good creation ended up corrupted. And indeed, not only was it corrupted, it ended up dying. So this goodness ended up leading to a kind of death. Now we can talk about biological death, like when our heart stops beating. But the Bible's even concerned with a sort of spiritual death. The good gift, which also meant a good relationship with God, got ruined. And so this ruination, or the illness that turned the good gift to something dead, is evil. So notice I use that term illness. You can think of it almost like a fever. Another way you can think about it as a parasite. Like if you know a parasite who comes and just lives off a host, like if you've ever seen like a worm that lives in a dog or something, and it's literally just sucking out the life to have its own life. You can think about evil as a parasite. You can think about evil as something that corrupts the good. So think of metal that's turning rusty, and the rust kind of destroys the very nature of the metal. Evil is sort of a wasting disease, to go back to illness. Evil is something that corrupts and destroys. It does not have a nature of its own. Another way to think of it is tooth decay. You all have been to the dentist, and you know what this is about. Each of you have teeth, right? Your teeth were hopefully made well, unless there was some environmental factor that made them not well. And so here's a healthy tooth, right? This is the way it was intended to be. The blood comes in, the tooth is healthy, but all of a sudden a little spot appears here, and a little spot appears here, and it starts to sort of eat away at what was put in place. So God puts this enamel in place on the tooth, and this just comes to start to kind of wear through it with a sort of acid, right? Tooth decay and acid. Well, what happens then is now the hole gets bigger, and now the problem gets bigger, and now the integrity of the tooth is compromised. So we can think of evil like these spots appearing on the tooth and eating away the goodness of the enamel, and now you can see it's actually getting into the dentine of the tooth. And now things get really bad. Now not only has evil penetrated the top, but it's also got into the dentine and then the pulp. So now it's in the most sensitive part of the tooth, and this is where you get a tooth infection, this is where you get a toothache, this is where you have to have surgery on your teeth. And the idea with evil is, if it gets stopped up here, like if your dentist gives you a filling, then all of this remains healthy. If it gets down here, well, we can probably still fill it in, but we definitely don't want it to get to this stage, because then the work to save the tooth, if you can save it, is significant. So think about evil like the spots that appear on decaying teeth, and if it's not dealt with, you end up finally with the tooth itself being compromised, and sometimes the tooth even dying. Another way to think about what I'm saying is someone on methamphetamine. I think you've seen these pictures at school. So here's a lady before she started taking meth. And you kind of see the goodness of her face, if you want to put it that way, in terms of she hasn't been worn down or wasted by the drug. Now here she is 2.5 years later, and notice the difference. It's the same person. So at the core, she's the same of who she was, but now look at how unhealthy she looks. Look at how she's wasting away. Look at how she's aged. Look at the difference in her eyes and her demeanor. This is a picture of evil's effect. So when we talk about evil wasting people, this is what we're talking about. So when we're praying to God, God, deliver us from evil, we're saying, God, deliver us from these things that would seek to rot us and seek to infect us and make us sick. Deliver us from those things that would begin to waste our lives. And notice, people who are normally on drugs, not only do they have the physical impact, but they also have broken relationships, they have people they don't trust, and they get involved oftentimes in other kinds of illegal activity, theft, and the like. So we're saying, God, deliver us from this force that would come and corrupt the good gifts that you've given me, or the good gifts that you've made of my life. So even if you may not be able to define what evil is, you can say, well, I know what it looks like. It looks like decay of a tooth. It looks like someone on meth. Another way that we talk about evil is with darkness. So if evil is a kind of absence, then there's an absence of the light, right? And when we say, God, deliver us from evil, notice this picture where you have a door opening so you can see the light. If you're in an all-dark room and you don't know how to get out of the darkness, praying, deliver us from evil is saying, God, open up a doorway so I can see your light. There's a very famous verse in the Bible where we hear it said, the light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. You could take one candle into a dark room, and it doesn't matter how deep and profound the darkness gets, the candle will still shine. So darkness is not something that exists by itself. Darkness is the absence of light. And when light is introduced into the darkness, you are able to see. And so when we're saying, God, deliver us, we're saying, God, give us your light. Another way to understand the prayer is that when we say, deliver us from evil, this darkness can oppress you. And not only that, this darkness can enslave you. So I'm actually showing you a picture of some slave chains, and these are much older even than the experience of slavery in America. These come all the way back from Europe almost 1,000 years ago. And when we say deliver us from evil, it's every place that darkness has chained us, every place that we do begin to get corrupted. We're saying, God, come and break these chains. God, set me free from the oppressing power of the darkness. And so that verb deliver is very powerful. And in fact, it comes from the Latin word to make free. When you're saying, God, deliver us from evil, you're saying, God, let me be free. Let me be free from fear. Let me be free from an oppressive desire. Let me be free to live and walk as your child. All right, well, let's take just a bit to talk a little bit about the devil. Now, the word devil, you'll also hear him called Satan. And Satan's actually a title, meaning the accuser. Imagine, if you will, you get arrested and are taken to court. The prosecuting attorney stands before the judge and says, this person has committed the following crimes. And so when we talk about Satan as the accuser, Satan is the one who stands before God and says, don't you know who this person is, God? They've done X, Y, and Z. They're not good. They don't deserve your love and mercy. And this is why, over against Satan as the accuser, we have the Holy Spirit as our advocate. So the Holy Spirit's like the defense attorney who says, but look to your Son, Jesus, and let them live in your kingdom and grace. Now, the tradition, at least, is that the devil is a fallen angel. Now, when we say fallen, what we mean is when God's good creation gets corrupted, it's not just something that happens in our physical universe, it's something that has a heavenly reality too. And there were angels who rebelled against God. So think about kind of a angel rebellion. And at least the tradition says the reason they rebelled is because they did not think that human beings should be elevated to God's own life. So, right, you have the story, you have God up here, and then underneath God you have the angels, and then underneath the angels you have humans. And the idea is God's going to take humans and elevate them up here, above the angels. And so because the angels are prideful, who could be more beautiful than we are, they rebel against God and try and create an alternate reality. Now, the creature called the devil, then, as a fallen angel, is named Lucifer, which is morning star. And he's called Lucifer because he's so beautiful. So oftentimes we think of the devil as a monster, but the scriptures themselves say he sometimes appears as an angel of light. This is why you have to be very careful, because the devil is not going to appear to you and scare you. The devil is going to seek to entice you away from following God. And so when you say, God, let me, deliver me from evil, you're saying, God, please save me from being attacked or being bitten or being poisoned by the one who would lead me away from you. And let him not accuse me in your presence. Now, one thing I want to combat a little bit is the idea that the devil and Jesus are kind of in a 50-50 fight. So this is from a cartoon, which I think most of you will recognize. And always when they show Jesus and the devil, Jesus is like this little wimpy guy, and the devil's like this big brute with horns. You have to understand that the devil himself was made to be good, and that his goodness was corrupted. So the only reality is the one that God has made, and anyone who departs from that reality simply then lives as a kind of corruption, like rust on metal, like decay on teeth, like cancer in a body. And so I want you to really be challenged that we're not talking about evil and good being in a kind of conflict where they're each 50-50. God wins. This is very clear. God wins. And so if you're on God's side, you're on the winning side. And though evil might be impressive or have some good tricks, it has already been conquered on the cross. I think a better image for Satan is the poisonous viper, and here you have a rattlesnake. So think of the devil as a snake who will poison you if he bites you, and so he is to be avoided. I don't think any of you would go and play with a rattlesnake because you know that if he bites you, it could kill you. And so this is the same way when Christians are called to resist evil or when Christians are called to avoid temptation. And when we're praying, do not deliver us from evil. We're praying, don't let us be snake bit. Don't let us be bit by the venom of Satan. I want to look at this statue too and then talk a little bit more about what it means for Christians and what I mean when I say that we already have the victory in our hands. Here you see a lion stepping on the head of a snake, and the snake has coiled around his paw, and the snake has bit his foot, but the lion is still victorious. So early in the story, this goes all the way back to the book of Genesis, we have the first prophecy that God is going to send a Savior, and it's in Genesis 3. God is talking to the woman in the garden, and he says that she will give birth to one who will deliver, and will deliver the human race. So when we say deliver us from evil, and we get talk of a foot and a heel. So she says, or she's told, your foot will strike the head of the snake. So let's imagine this is a snake head, and since I'm not a good drawer, I'm just going to write it. Your foot will smash the head of the snake. So imagine someone stepping on a snake's head. But the snake will strike or bruise your heel. So the snake will be crushed, his head will be crushed, but he'll be able to strike with his venom. And so the one who steps on the snake will be poisoned. In Christian teaching, that prophecy is fulfilled on the cross. Jesus goes to the cross, and underneath it, if you imagine the cross almost like a sword, right? So now don't just imagine it as a piece of wood. Imagine the cross as a sword, and down here we have the snake's head. I told you I shouldn't draw it. So we have the snake's head, and he's going to crush the snake's head to conquer evil, but the snake's now going to have an open mouth and bite him, and he'll be poisoned. And so that's what happens. Jesus is poisoned on the cross, and he dies, and the hope is, will he be raised to life again? Now, of course, we know that on Easter he is raised from the dead, and the snake, though, is still crushed. And so when we say, deliver us from evil, we're saying, Jesus, you crushed the head of evil. You crushed the head of the snake on the cross. And you've tasted the poison of sin, which infects us. And so only you have the power to deliver us from this cunning and powerful enemy. And so that's part of what we're saying, too. It's bringing us back to the cross, where Jesus himself was victorious over the serpent. Well, that will conclude our video. I know you'll probably have lots of questions, and I look forward to discussing those and discussing this further when we are all together.